Ah, nice, nice. Finally, it's been 9 days since the last time, so it's time to go back and take a look at how the raid has progressed in this week. Tomorrow, very likely, we will go over Mythic Plus, but for now, we have to look at how the performance of all of the specs and the popularity of all of the specs has continued in raid encounters. It's been slightly over a week since the last time we went through this. There have been some interesting changes that I will have fun talking about. This is my favorite part of a new tier, having to look and observe all of the tiny little changes in the specs, changing their talents, their legendaries, the way they play and whatnot, which specs are considered good and bad at the very start of a tier can change very often. And we are gonna have a couple of examples today as well. Today is also the day where we can get to see a few more bosses. Last week we stopped at Painsmith, and even at Painsmith we didn't have too many logs. Today we can add Painsmith, we can add Guardian of the First Ones, and we can even start looking at Fate Scribe. So there is gonna be even more room for specs to change how they perform with the new bosses. But first, as usual, before we look at anything more in-depth, we have to look at the participation, the popularity, i.e. just how many people are playing the specs. So first, we have to start with the shocking piece of news that Survival is the least played DPS spec in the game when it comes to raiding. I know it was hard to predict, and there has been little change from last week. The other thing that was very hard to predict is that Balanced Druid is still the most popular spec in the game, including healers and tanks as well. It's just the more represented. Now, the first thing that we can talk about, that we can see very clearly here, is that there has been a pretty big jump to get all the way up to the podium. One might even say a pretty big heroic leap. Okay, that was bad. However, Arms Warrior is now the second most played DPS spec in raids. This was pretty important because last week we stopped at Arms being just 6th. And even before that it was lower and lower. It has progressively gained ground over time. Last week we had a very big clump of DPS specs: Destruction, Frost Mage, Marksmanship, Havoc, and Arms, all between 11-ish thousand to 10,000, so there was just a very little gap between all of them. Now the gap hasn't really changed that much. They are still between 17 to 18,000, so they have all grown at a very similar level, except Arms, who has done a tiny bit more than all of them. And then on a similar note, Fury, Warrior, the left behind spec of Warrior, hasn't really grown as much. Very predictable, since most of the other warriors are just gonna go Arms. The other thing perhaps worth mentioning is that Subtlety is also gaining more ground and getting closer and closer to Assassination. We left last week and Subtlety was at less than half of the representation of Assassination rogues. So for every sub-rogue, there were basically 2.2 Assassination rogue players, whereas now the gap has been shortened by a quite big amount. The outlaw players haven't really gone anywhere. They are still there, very low, so this points towards more Assassination players starting to transition to Subtlety, at the very least more than before. This is something I pointed out before, being very good and very favorable to rogues, because now rogues, at least Assassination and Subtlety, are Venthyr, which means you can much more easily respec between Assassination and Subtlety without losing too much. True, Assassination isn't really using the Covenant legendary for Venthyr like Subtlety is, so you would have to split your time, or rather you would have to split your Soul Cinders between two different legendaries, but that is only the main block that stops you from being able to play both specs at once. So it's very easy right now for rogues to change spec, much easier, for example, than if you were a mage, having to go between Nightfae, Kyrian, or Venthyr, for example. The last thing that is worth mentioning when it comes to DPS is Hunters. As you can see, the gap between Marksmanship and Beast Mastery is growing, or rather shrinking, more and more. Last time we checked this, Marksmanship was just about twice as popular as Beast Mastery Hunter, whereas now it is quite a bit less than twice as much than BM. So BM is gaining more and more ground. it might have looked like possibly problematic, unlike the rogues being able to interchange their two specs, because more marksmanship hunters were going Kyrian, whereas BM Hunter never really moved from Night Fae. But right now it seems to be that even marksmanship hunters are giving up a little bit more on the hopes of Kyrian and are going back to Night Fae anyways. So when you stay Night Fae as a marksmanship hunter, you have an even better ability of switching from marksmanship to Beast Mastery without losing too much. And yes, of course, you also do need 2 different legendaries. Now, outside of the popularity of the DPS, not really much to say when it comes to the popularity of the healers, because it has continued roughly on the same note. Last time, Restoration, Shaman, and Holy Paladin were very, very close to each other, and now a little bit over a week later, they are still very, very close to each other, with a big gap from the rest, with the 3 other healing specs very close to each other, Holy Priest, Discipline Priest, and Restoration Druid with Mistweaver having quite a bit of a drop from the rest. Where we can have something worth mentioning is in the tanks, because a couple of weeks ago I mentioned Blood DK was going to pass Vengeance Demon Hunter. It was inevitable, but maybe it was a little bit too early. So I said, okay, let's just wait a week. Okay, so a week ago I was then expecting Blood DK to finally have passed Vengeance Demon Hunter, and no, not quite. So I was like, fine, have it your way, surely the week after that, surely by today, Blood DK will have passed Vengeance Demon Hunter. And then, of course, since I know my stuff, today we can see... Are you shitting me? Come, what is this? Come on, what? 6 logs, really? Okay, fine. Let's just assume there's been a bug and a few more Vengeance Demon Hunters have been counted, and let's just treat this as if Blood DK has finally passed Vengeance Demon Hunter. This comes, of course, with the revelation that Havoc Demon Hunter is now very strong, which means more and more Vengeance Demon Hunters can go back playing Havoc. There is not as much of a need of keeping a Demon Hunter as a tank for the Raid debuff, etc, etc. Vengeance Demon Hunter we have also seen, and we will likely see when we go over the Mythic Plus video, probably tomorrow, that Vengeance isn't even the most popular tank in Mythic Plus anymore either, so even less of a reason to keep playing Vengeance, so it was likely that other tanks were going to take its spot in raiding. Now, yes, this was all nice and cool, but as usual, just like last week, Aizen, I want to see some damage numbers. I want to see how the specs have been doing. Is my spec meta yet? Or should I just delete the character? So, last week we left with the overall damage looking like this. We pointed out how pretty much all of the Melee DPS specs were towards the top, and there was a considerable drop of all of the caster specs. Particularly, it's pretty impressive to see all of the mage specs all at the bottom, right? The only ones that were sort of escaping this were pretty much just Demonology and Affliction. So, what do we have today? Okay, so Demonology and Affliction are still indeed escaping this massacre of casters. We have a new caster making way towards the top, which is Elemental, and several of the other Melee DPS specs which were performing towards the top are still there, because Windwalker Monk is still there, Arms Warrior is still there, Feral has dropped a lot, but it is still towards the top half, so is Havoc Demon Hunter, together of course with the rogue specs. No particular change for the specs that were underperforming before that we mentioned, like all 3 of the mage specs, as well as Shadow Priest and even Balanced Druid that we kind of pointed out before. We also have the continuation of this situation where, despite many of the Melee DPS specs are doing fine, Unholy is not one of them and is even being, let's say, surpassed by Frost Death Knight. Now, when we look at the causes, when we try to think about, okay, why are these specs here? What has made them come to this point? Is the fact, this is always worth mentioning again, whenever a new boss is being killed, whenever guilds kill the boss, pretty much the ranking is going to be decided by, is the boss single target, is the boss cleave, is the boss AoE? Depending on what you do on that boss, all of the results of the DPS are going to be, put together in the average. So if we stop up to a certain point and the next week we meet again in this video, and two very heavy AoE bosses have just been killed by hundreds of kills, many of the specs that do very well in AoE are going to suddenly shoot up in the overall rankings because they got to kill some very favorable AoE bosses. So which were the bosses that got killed more and more this week? One was the big cockblock, which was Painsmith Rasnal. Not just last week was being killed, but also after the nerf that he has recently received. Painsmith Rasnal has continued to have more or less a similar result in terms of performance to what we had last week, in the sense that very quick and fast AoE damage specs have been able to get very high logs in. So Windwalker, Frost DK, Retribution Paladin, Fury and Arms Warrior, Demonology Warlock, Marksmanship Hunter, even Unholy DK, which is not doing too well overall, are still being able to get towards the top because of the amount of damage they can do to the adds. Same as last week, I will repeat, the damage to the adds is not really important. Literally no raid leader is going to give a shit how much AoE damage you can bring on Painsmith. You spec for single target on Painsmith, not for AoE. AoE is irrelevant, however, it's going to show up in the overall damage. It's going to give you the impression that a spec is doing much better than it is, purely because of the AoE damage available on Painsmith. And then, of course, all of the specs with much lower AoE, or maybe tons of AoE, but it is too slow, so they don't have the time, because those adds die very quickly, so you don't have the time, for example, as an Elemental Shaman or a Balance Druid to get your AoE rolling, because stuff is just dying too quickly. This week is going to be pretty cool, because we also have Guardian of the First Ones, which is a pure single target boss. So we do an exact opposite, an exact role reversal, where we go from AoE deciding a lot of the damage of the meters of the rankings for Soul Render and Painsmith into Guardian of the First Ones. Here you can see something very predictable like a Feral Druid being on top of the meters, and also something equally predictable like a spec that doesn't have a very high single target like Destruction Warlock. They have nothing to cleave with their Havoc, so they are massively hindered in how much damage they can do. Frost DK, Windwalker Monk, Marksmanship Hunter, Elemental Shaman, all very apt AoE specs, don't really get to shine a lot on Guardian of the First Ones. Several other pretty good single target specs are going to be found at the top, no surprises for Subtlety, for Demonology, Shadow Priest, Enhancement. The only surprise we can say is Outlaw. Outlaw is not technically a very powerful single target spec, they don't really shine in other single target phases of the bosses. The reason why they are there for now, I would say it is simply because they have 9 logs compared to the few hundreds of the other more popular specs. So it might just be a case of simply good luck, or luck in the sense of scarcity of logs. So we are kind of disqualifying Outlaw until we get more proof that they can actually do that much single target damage. What is also still worth mentioning is that we have now changed multiple damage profiles, and the mage specs are still at the bottom. We have seen a intermittent AoE fight like Soul Render, where there is quite a few rounds of adds that can live a little bit longer, and yet mages are not doing too well there. And then we go to Painsmith, which is a lot of single target and then some very condensed AoE phases happening twice in the fight. Mage is still at the bottom, and then we go here, which is pure single target, and Mage is still at the bottom. Even if we go all the way back to the 9, the fight with 2 to 3 targets at the very start, and then the last part of a single target fight, mages are still towards the bottom pack of the DPS. And then even Ner'zhul, with a little bit of cleave with the orbs, still at the bottom. The fight where they are performing the best overall is Eye of the Jailer, which is a much longer cleave fight where you can see Frost Mage, right? Frost Mage with its splitting ice, being able to constantly hit 2 targets with Ice Lance, doing a little bit better. And even then, it doesn't even break the top 10. So we can definitely say that the biggest surprise of the entire tier so far is how little mages have been doing compared to last year. It looks like after the nerf of Fire Mage in trying to buff and make Arcane and Frost more viable, even if they looked so in the sims and in theory, it doesn't seem like in practice they are actually showing up as very powerful and competitive specs so far. unlocking Covenant-specific legendaries or unlocking particularly powerful soul-buying traits doesn't seem to have done anything for mages either. So that is pretty interesting of a development when it comes to damage. I'm sure you're not used to not seeing mages being at the top. I do remember, because I was there in 1973, the last time mages weren't doing too well in a raid. I remember, but many people will not remember the last time mages have not been very good. Now, after Guardian, we can touch very briefly on Fate Scribe. That's because, again, Fate Scribe is still pretty tight on the amount of logs available, so we don't have exactly, okay, a very large amount of logs, a very large amount of data to see if this is the numbers the specs are going to have in Fate Scribe or if it's just a few outliers. The thing worth mentioning when it comes to Fate Scribe is that the damage split, so the amount of damage the raid is supposed to be doing in the fight, is roughly split something like 60-40, so 60 to the boss and then 40 to a bunch of adds. So there is the ability to do tons of AoE damage to spike up your logs, essentially. And as we have already seen in a couple of fights before, this is what it's going to be looking like if AoE is involved. Affliction Warlock, Frost DK, Outlaw, Windwalker, Fury Warrior, Elemental Shaman all show up at the top. And more single target focused specs like Enhancement, which was doing very well on Guardian, Feral Druid, Shadow Priest, Assassination Rogue, etc., are not doing as well. So this type of bob and weave of different types of damage profiles depending on the boss, changing how specs are being perceived in the overall damage, is going to continue. Kel'Thuzad and Sylvanas are both going to have some pretty wide, some pretty large AoE add damage phases, so you are going to be able to see those types of specs doing well. Don't expect something like a Feral Druid or likely something like an Assassination Rogue doing too well in the overall damage numbers in the last bosses of this tier. A tiny point regarding a few of the specs being here. One was the question we were having, and we will check this a little bit more when we go over the Mythic Plus video about Discipline Priests and their change to Kyrian and how they want to play, especially now that they can use the Boon of the Ascended legendary. The start of the tier was filled with, question marks and uncertainty. Some people were still Ventir, some people were moving Kyrian, some people had the big brain and moved Kyrian beforehand during Castelnatria. Other Discipline Priests were one-trick ponies and they could only play with Spirit Shell and they totally did not adapt to Evangelism, or maybe they were just skeptical about moving away from their Absorb playstyle to an HPS playstyle. So at the start, it looked like it was a little bit split. Now, not really. Now, the vast majority, over 90% pretty much, of all Discipline Priests in raiding are going to be playing with Evangelism. They have dropped Spirit Shell altogether. We have also started to see more and more usage of the Boon of the Ascended legendary instead of their old faithful Clarity of Mind. So now that we acknowledge this in raiding, this question is going to be more important in whether or not Discipline Priest will be able to have competitive damage with a Ventir Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus keys, now that they can use Boon of the Ascended and reduce it all the way down to a 1-minute cooldown from a 3-minute cooldown that they previously would have had. So that is going to be pretty interesting. The other interesting thing is Warlock, specifically Affliction, because so far Demonology and Destruction have been splitting the bosses between themselves. They are the two more popular Warlock specs. For every Affliction Warlock you see, there is going to be 12 Demolocks, and there is going to be 20 Destruction Warlocks. So Affliction, even now, is the second least played spec in the game when it comes to raid encounters. The interesting thing is that for a few weeks now, I believe this is the third week since Affliction is in the top half, and the second week in a row that Affliction is in the top 5 or so. In this case, it's even third overall. And as we go by all of the bosses, we can see that the damage profile of Affliction has drastically changed from before. Before, it was considered some very high power single target spec with a very strong burst with their Dark Lair on single target, very weak dots, very weak power to multi-dot and cleave dot everywhere. Now it's a little bit different. Now they are not even doing that. Now they are just doing AoE. Pure, unfiltered, Seed of Corruption AoE. They have somewhat followed the same pattern that Elemental Shaman has been following. Nerfed in single target, buffed in AoE, ditching any pretense of being a balanced spec and just dumping everything they can in more powerful AoE. Even on a fight like Ner'zhul, which looks like kind of mostly single target, Affliction is still the highest and best performing ranged spec. So you're like, huh, interesting. That's because they have the ability to deal with the orbs very, very quickly, to have this type of damage when it comes to orb damage. The same can be said with something like Soul Render adds. They can go to town on them because they stay alive long enough to allow them to do the burst damage. We have seen the Painsmith Rasnal AoE damage. Affliction was doing pretty badly on that fight. And the reason is this. The reason is that they don't really have the time to do damage to those adds like they can on Soul Render, which means their overall damage is going to be mostly around single target, which is poor, so they don't do too well. Because of this stronger AoE power they have, more and more fights are going to allow Affliction to use Decaying Soul Satchel, which is the 20% crit and 20% haste buff they can get, since Soul Rot can hit 4 targets, which is also pretty much the same thing they use almost exclusively in Mythic Plus for AoE. So that's pretty much what they are doing in raids as well. The only outlier, the one who actually seem stronger in all of the different types of damage profile, is Arms Warrior. Because we have talked about, and we have just seen in all of these damage charts, specs doing very well whenever AoE is involved, like Windwalker, like Frost DK. If they have the time to do their AoE, there is Elemental and there is Affliction. Specs that do better when it comes to single target, like Feral, like Shadow Priest, even Enhancement Shaman, Assassination Rogue and Subtlety Rogue. And then we have seen one spec which is just there every time, and that is Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior right now just seems to be in the right place at the right time, because they have very consistent and very powerful single target, but they can still use Bladestorm and Ancient Aftershock to pad some AoE whenever is good. So whenever the adds are spawning on Soul Render, Ancient Aftershock and Bladestorm can give them tons of damage. Same can be done in Painsmith Rasnal for tons of AoE damage. On Ner'zhul, it's a bunch of adds dying quickly. They can cleave with Sweeping Strikes. They get free executes on the orbs, which allows them to be still high. The 9 is kind of the same. You have 3 different bosses to execute. It feels great. They just seem like the one that has more of everything right now, compared to all the other specs, which seem to have some pretty clear strengths and weaknesses when it comes to damage profiles. Oh, this is a single target fight, I can expect them at the top. This is an AoE fight, I can expect them towards the bottom. Pretty much Arms Warrior is like escaping from all of this. So, for now, we can stop. We are done with our weekly overview of Raid Encounters. This was the 7th week of 9.1. Tomorrow, I think, or Saturday, we will go over Mythic Plus as well to see what changed. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to continue supporting the channel, or if you aren't already, leave a like and a comment, and if you want, a subscribe as well. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I have to go and eat and choose my pasta. Right now, I'm kind of tending towards farfalle, actually.